Imagine a field, drenched in rain, near a quiet French village, on August 26th, in the year 1870. 9,000 weary English soldiers stand their ground, bracing for the inevitable. Ahead of them, a shimmering tide of 30,000 of Europe's most elite knights, a sight of overwhelming power. The French, superior in numbers, armed with heavy cavalry, and boasting the very flower of European nobility, seemed utterly invincible. Their confidence, an absolute and gilded cage, led highborn lords to openly bicker over who would earn the glory of slaying the English king himself. Yet, just 4 hours later, the battlefield told a different, horrifying story. 1,500 French nobles lay dead, princes, dukes, and even kings among them. The English, by contrast, had lost a mere 40 men, not 400, but 40. In a single afternoon, 5 centuries of armored dominance collapsed, undone by commoners wielding wood and string. The blind king of Bohemia, unwilling to be excluded from the storm of death, rode straight into its heart. French knights, in a panicked retreat, crushed their own men underfoot. The Genoese crossbowmen, highly paid mercenaries hired to support them, were shockingly slaughtered by the very nobles who commanded them. For weeks, the crows, gorged on princely flesh, grew so monstrously bloated they struggled to hoist their heavy bodies from the blood-soaked soil. This was the Battle of Crécy, the day medieval warfare died in the mud. The moment when the ingrained idea of nobility through combat was shattered by the hands of peasant archers. It was the true beginning of the 100 Years' War, marked by France's most humiliating defeat. By the end of this story, you will understand how a weapon worth 10 shillings destroyed armor priced at £1,000, why French knights turned on their own mercenaries mid-battle, and how a blind king's doomed charge became one of the most tragically noble deaths in military history. Let's set the stage for this cataclysm. Edward III of England had recently landed in Normandy with around 15,000 men, pressing his claim to the French throne through his mother's lineage. His forces carved a path of destruction across northern France in what was known as a chevauchée, legalized plunder meant to expose the French king's inability to protect his own people. After looting Caen, the English were in retreat toward the English-held port of Calais when the French army finally caught them. Philip VI of France had raised the mightiest host in Christendom, between 30 and 35,000 men, including 12,000 heavy cavalry, knights clad in full plate atop armored horses. This was no ordinary army. Nearly every great noble in France was there, joined by allied princes and monarchs from across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire sent contingents, the King of Bohemia arrived with his court, and even Moravia sent knights. It was a medieval Avengers Assemble, united by one singular goal: English blood. The French knight was the tank of his age, a mounted warrior in full armor, with his steed weighed close to a ton. They were raised for battle from childhood, trained to fight before most peasants learned to read. Their armor alone cost more than an entire village earned in a lifetime. For 500 years, the thunder of the cavalry charge had decided European wars. Infantry existed merely to be crushed under hoof. Archers were considered nuisances at best. Real men, noble men, fought sword to sword on horseback. Edward III knew his odds were hopeless, outnumbered 3 to 1, drained from weeks of raiding, and short on supplies. Yet he held one profound advantage. The French utterly scorned his 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. Most were peasants or criminals, hardened by years of archery practice enforced by English law. Every Sunday after church, men were legally required to train with the bow. Playing other sports instead was literally illegal. The longbow itself was deceptively plain, a 6-foot stave of yew wood, but deadly in skilled hands. A practiced archer could loose 12 arrows a minute, striking targets 250 yards away, about 2.5 football fields. The draw weight was enormous, between 150 and 80 pounds. Archaeologists can still identify longbow archers by their warped skeletons. The left arm stretched longer from years of strain. Edward positioned his army on high ground, forcing the French to attack uphill. He divided his forces into 3 lines, the archers forming a V shape between them for overlapping fields of fire. Then he did something no king had ever dared. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot. English nobles fighting as infantry was unheard of. But Edward understood what his enemies did not. The age of the mounted knight was ending. His command sent shockwaves through his camp. Men bred for the roar of the charge, whose horses were worth their weight in gold, now had to fight beside peasants. Pride clashed with survival. But Edward made it clear, only the living would keep their honor. One by one, armored nobles trudged into the mud beside bowmen in woolen hoods, a sight no soul in Christendom had ever witnessed. That night, the English camp was eerily calm. Archers tended their bows, rubbing beeswax on strings to repel moisture. Stakes were hammered into the ground, trenches dug by torchlight. Chronicles say Edward even distributed meat and ale, so his men slept on full stomachs, while the French stumbled into camp half-starved after their forced march. Everything about the English lines spoke of discipline. Everything about the French army reeked of arrogance.
Edward's men fortified the slope, digging pits to trip cavalry, driving sharpened stakes to impale charging horses. They transformed the hillside into a death trap, then waited. Across the valley, French chaos hid behind glittering splendor. Nobles paraded in polished armor, banners whipping in the wind, each determined to outshine the next. Dukes and counts bickered over who would lead the charge or seize Edward alive for ransom. Some boasted they would drag the English king back in chains by nightfall. Philip VI's attempts at order were drowned in a storm of horns, drums, and vanity. The scene resembled a tournament more than a disciplined army. When dawn broke on August 26th, the French vanguard advanced through the smoldering ruins left by Edward's chevauchée. Villages still burned, crops lay in ash, livestock scattered, a grim prelude to the slaughter that was about to begin. Peasants muttered curses as they watched ranks of armored knights thunder past the wreckage of their homes. To the French nobility, this devastation was an insult, demanding instant vengeance. To the English, it proved their plan was working. They had turned France itself into a weapon. Philip VI's army reached Crécy around 4 in the afternoon on August 26th, utterly exhausted after a punishing march. The sensible decision would have been to rest and strike at dawn. Philip actually gave the order to halt, but patience was not a French noble's virtue. Strategy was for lesser men. They saw the English perched on that hill, unnumbered, filthy, far from home, and smelled glory. Each lord wanted to be the one to capture or kill Edward III. By late afternoon, thunderclouds gathered. A sudden downpour drenched the fields. The French laughed, trusting their plate armor to keep them safe. But the storm meant something entirely different for missile troops. The English quietly unstrung their bows, tucking the cords under helmets and cloaks to keep them dry. The Genoese crossbowmen, their hired allies, were not so lucky. Their bowstrings slackened and stretched, useless compared to the tautness of the English longbows. That small act of foresight, a few minutes of preparation, would decide the fate of thousands. When Philip VI finally arrived and saw the English calmly arrayed on the slope, banners rippling in the wind, he again commanded his men to wait for morning.
But knights do not wait. Behind him, counts and dukes surged forward, shouting that daylight was wasting and glory slipping away. Some had already lowered their lances. The king's command dissolved instantly. The grand French host ceased to be an army. It became a mob of impatient aristocrats, unwilling to let discipline stand between them and vanity. Thus, the Battle of Crécy began, not with strategy, but with pride spiraling out of control. The vanguard ignored orders and advanced.
Once a few nobles began to move, the rest followed, desperate not to be left behind in the chase for fame. Philip had lost control before the first blow was struck. What followed was not a battle, it was a noble mob galloping to its own destruction. First came the Genoese crossbowmen, 5,000 of the finest mercenary marksmen money could buy. But there was an issue. Their pavises, the large shields used for cover while reloading, were still with the baggage train. They had to advance without protection. The recent rain had also ruined them. While English archers had kept their bowstrings dry, the Genoese strings sagged and weakened, cutting their range nearly in half. They marched forward to about 150 yards and loosed their first volley. Most bolts fell short. Then came the English reply. 5,000 longbows sang together, a sound described by witnesses as thunder. The sky darkened beneath the storm of arrows. Each archer loosed 12 per minute, 60,000 shafts raining down every 60 seconds. The Genoese had no shields, no cover, and their crossbows took half a minute to reload against the longbows' 5 seconds. They were being erased from existence. Panic broke them, and they fled back toward their own lines. And then came madness. Count d'Alençon, seeing the retreat, bellowed, "Cut down this rabble blocking our way!" French knights spurred forward, mowing down their own mercenaries. They literally slaughtered the Genoese for not dying fast enough. Caught between English arrows and French blades, the mercenaries were annihilated. Those few who escaped cursed their employers and abandoned the field. Now the main assault began, 12,000 mounted knights charging uphill through mud and over corpses into a rain of English arrows. This is where the longbow's real terror showed itself. At long range, arrows often failed to pierce the best plate armor, but they did not need to. They found the horse's eyes, mouths, joints, legs, the soft places no armor covered. A horse weighing 1,500 pounds, hit by multiple arrows, did not keep charging. It screamed, reared, and collapsed, becoming a wall of flesh that halted those behind. Knights crashed into the fallen. The charge lost all momentum. At closer distances, under 100 yards, the longbow's bodkin-tipped arrows proved devastating. They could pierce mail and even plate armor at weak points, through visors into faces, through joints into armpits, through mail into thighs. Even when they did not penetrate, the impact was brutal, like being struck with a heavy hammer. Repeated hits rattled the men inside their armor, a sickening sound described as dice inside a cup. The French charged again and again, waves upon waves climbing over their own dead and dying. The English archers, with foresight, had pre-planted arrows in the ground for easy access, ensuring a ceaseless storm of fire. Chroniclers of the time said the arrows fell like snow, so dense that the knights could barely see through them. But it was not just the arrows doing the killing. The terrain itself, meticulously shaped by Edward's men, became an executioner. Horses broke legs in hidden pits. Riders crashed onto sharpened stakes. The soaked earth turned into a sucking mud that clung to everything, making movement agonizing. Knights who fell could not rise under the 60 pounds of steel they wore. They became immobile targets, helpless against the relentless barrage. And here is the image that truly defines the horror of that day.
When the English archers eventually began to run out of their carefully prepared supply, they rushed into the field during brief lulls. They pulled shafts from the corpses and even the wounded Frenchmen, then fired them back. The French were dying by their own recycled pain. Their own arrows returned to them with lethal intent. Then entered the blind King John of Bohemia, a figure tragically determined to die with honor. Blind for nearly a decade, he refused to leave the field, even as the battle turned into a rout. When told the battle was irrevocably lost, he reportedly declared, "The King of Bohemia does not flee from battle." He ordered his knights to tie their horses together with rope so they could guide him forward, moving as one unit. He wanted to strike at least one blow, just one, before his inevitable death. The blind 50-year-old king charged straight into the English lines, slashing at sound and shadow, a defiant gesture against the storm. He and all his bound knights were cut down instantly. When his body was found, he was still tied to his fallen companions, sword gripped in hand, eyes open, staring blankly at the sky. He had fulfilled his wish. He had struck before dying. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was so moved by his courage that he adopted John's personal emblem, 3 ostrich feathers, and the motto, Ich dien, meaning I serve. It remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this very day. By nightfall, the French had charged a staggering 16 separate times. 16 suicidal waves of noble blood thrown into the grinder of English arrows and fortified terrain. Each charge was less disciplined than the one before. Desperate nobles fought each other for the front, for one last chance at glory, only to sink and die in the same mud as all the others. Philip VI himself led the final desperate charge. His horse was struck down beneath him, and an arrow tore through his jaw. His loyal guards had to literally drag him from the battlefield as he struggled, half mad with fury and pain, to rejoin the fight. The sacred oriflamme, France's ancient battle banner believed to promise victory, was left abandoned in the mud. As night fell, the English could barely believe what had happened. They held their ground until morning, cutting down any wounded Frenchmen who tried to crawl away. Their arrow supply had long been exhausted, forcing them to finish the job with knives, mallets, and wooden stakes. English peasant archers were literally clubbing French nobles to death with sticks in the darkness. When dawn broke on August 27th, the scale of the massacre became undeniable. The flower of French aristocracy lay lifeless in the mud. The Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Alençon, the Count of Sancerre, the list seemed endless, a roll call of shattered dynasties. Over 1,500 nobles were dead, 11 princes, and thousands of lesser knights. The Genoese mercenaries who had not fled were also slaughtered, many by the very men who had hired them, in a grotesque betrayal of battlefield loyalty. English losses, in stark contrast, totaled around 40 dead, with only 2 knights among them. This meant 1 English knight for every 750 French nobles. The imbalance was so absurd that chroniclers of the time refused to believe it, calling it an act of divine will. But the truth was far simpler. In one afternoon, the longbow had rendered heavy cavalry obsolete. Yet the true devastation was not just in the numbers, but in who had died. Medieval warfare had always relied on capturing nobles for ransom, a kind of unspoken contract of chivalry. Killing the wealthy was bad business, a waste of potential profit. But at Crécy, English archers, common men with no sense of knightly honor or the intricate rules of chivalry, simply killed everyone. They sent arrows through the faces of dukes and counts without caring who they were. The psychological shock to Europe's nobility was catastrophic. For centuries, being a knight meant inherent superiority, a divine right to dominate the battlefield. Crécy shattered that illusion. It proved irrevocably that a Welsh peasant with a bow could end the life of a lord as easily as another knight could. Military dominance no longer stemmed from noble blood, but from discipline, innovation, and cunning tactics. The aftermath of the battle was grotesque. So many nobles perished that there were simply not enough peers left alive to bury them with the customary honor. Bodies rotted for days in the humid heat, turning the battlefield into a macabre feast. Crows and wolves grew fat, feasting on princely flesh, their bellies distended from the abundance. Peasants, driven by desperation and opportunity, scavenged the dead, stripping armor and jewelry that would make them rich overnight. Armor, once meant to protect and symbolize status, was melted down and sold for profit, its symbolic value utterly destroyed. The exhausted English army marched onward to Calais, leaving behind a field so littered with noble corpses that locals eventually renamed it the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a grim reference to the shimmering garments and armor that covered the dead. For years afterward, farmers plowing the soil unearthed bones and rusted armor, grim relics of the day chivalry died. France was left in utter chaos. So many nobles gone in a single day created a massive leadership vacuum. Entire provinces lost their lords and protectors, their administrative structures collapsing. The French army had to be rebuilt almost from the ground up. Crossbowmen were recruited in greater numbers, native archer corps were formed, and, most humiliatingly, English infantry tactics were openly copied. Crécy also transformed the very nature of war itself. The proven dominance of archery meant combat now unfolded at range. The era of gallant cavalry charges, once the defining image of warfare, was finished. Battles became contests of positioning, strategic planning, and ranged firepower, not simply of courage or individual swordsmanship. The romance of medieval combat drowned irrevocably in the mud of Crécy. Yet, tragically, France failed to learn its lesson quickly. A decade later, at the Battle of Poitiers, they made virtually the same mistake, charging uphill into entrenched English archers with almost identical, devastating results. Another French king was captured, and thousands more nobles were slain. It would take nearly a century for France to fully accept that common archers were, in military terms, far more valuable than armored knights. The social consequences of Crécy were even deeper and more profound. If peasants, the lowest rung of society, could destroy nobles, the highest and most revered, what did that say about divine right? If Welsh criminals could slay princes, what truly justified the entire feudal order, the very structure of their world? Crécy did not just kill France's nobility. It murdered the deeply ingrained idea that noble blood inherently meant superiority on any field, especially the battlefield. The English longbowman became Europe's most feared and respected soldier, a symbol of a new era. But irony soon followed. The longbow required years of intense training, a lifetime of practice. You could not produce skilled archers overnight. When gunpowder arrived, bringing with it weapons that any peasant could master in a day, the longbow itself, the tool that had killed chivalry, was in turn destroyed by progress. Its reign, though impactful, was ultimately fleeting. The blind King John of Bohemia's final charge became legend, a symbol of doomed honor, a last desperate act against the inevitable tide of change. His decision to die fighting rather than retreat embodied the last flicker of medieval chivalry, a valor that prioritized glory over survival. His death marked the end of an age when courage and personal honor meant more than tactical advantage or sheer firepower. Modern historians universally regard Crécy as nothing short of a revolution in warfare. It proved that tactics and technology, when expertly combined, could crush vastly superior numbers and even the fiercest courage.
It showed that well-prepared defenses could obliterate mounted charges, and that coordinated firepower could utterly dominate hand-to-hand combat. Every principle of modern warfare, from strategic positioning to the importance of ranged weapons, was born in that muddy French field in the year 1346. But perhaps the most haunting image remains this: French knights, the proud, glittering elite of Christendom, trampling their own men, their own Genoese mercenaries, to reach the enemy faster, only to die in vast numbers beneath a ceaseless storm of arrows. English peasants, clad in simple wool, calmly firing into the chaos, watching as nobles fell like wheat before the scythe. The very Count d'Alençon, who had ordered the slaughter of his own Genoese allies, was himself struck through the face moments later, a swift and brutal poetic justice. The French killed more of their own that day than the English lost in total, a testament to their disorganization and arrogance. The crows, as chronicled, grew so fat from noble flesh that they could scarcely fly, waddling between corpses too heavy to take wing, a grotesque, living metaphor for the fall of an entire class and a way of life. Today, a small, unassuming monument marks the field at Crécy. Few visitors stop there, unaware of the immense significance of that quiet rural spot. Yet, on August 26, 1346, that muddy slope witnessed the medieval world come to an abrupt, violent end. 5 centuries of military tradition, the entire ingrained idea of warrior nobility, died in a single afternoon, slain by peasants armed with bent wood and simple string. The English did not just win a battle, they proved a devastating truth: that courage, no matter how fervent, could not defeat mathematics and the cold logic of overwhelming firepower. They proved that nobility, no matter how ancient or revered, could not stop a well-aimed arrow. And most profoundly, they proved that the age of the mounted knight, the symbol of European power for half a millennium, was undeniably over. France lost more than just men that day. They lost their belief in the natural order of the world, in the divine right that had underpinned their society for centuries. All it took was 5,000 peasants practicing archery every Sunday after church, their skill forged by law and relentless dedication, to utterly redefine warfare and shatter an empire's hubris. The story of Crécy serves as a potent reminder for us today. True strength lies not in inherited status or glittering tradition, but in adaptability, in embracing new ideas, and in the often overlooked power of the common man. It teaches us that even the most entrenched systems can be overturned by innovation and foresight. So, the next time you face a challenge that seems insurmountable, remember the English longbowmen.
Remember that, sometimes, the simplest tools, wielded with skill and discipline, can bring down the mightiest of adversaries. For society, progress is rarely about preserving old ways, but about having the wisdom to adapt.